The White House doubles down on President Trump's unverified claims of widespread voter fraud. I'm Elaine Quijano, and this is Red and Blue. Ahead on the program, executive action on a pair of controversial pipeline projects and the action behind the scenes in the Trump administration. But first, the latest action inside the White House briefing room, where on Tuesday, Press Secretary Sean Spicer defended Donald Trump's unverified claim that illegal ballots cost him a win in the popular vote.
His concerns of voter fraud and people voting illegally during the campaign. And he continues to maintain that belief based on studies and evidence that people have presented to him.
Is the White House going to formally ask for a probe into this alleged
No, I think he won very handily with 306 electoral votes, 33 states. He's very comfortable with his win, but I think...
It trouble him if he's bringing it up.
I think he was having a discussion with some folks and mentioned something in passing, which has been a long-standing belief that he's maintained. This isn't the first time that you've heard this concern of his.
The controversy overshadowed the events of yet another jam-packed day at the White House. The president began Tuesday by meeting with the CEOs of the big three auto companies, GM, Ford, and Fiat Chrysler, pledging to ease regulations to help businesses that add jobs within the U.S. He later signed another handful of executive actions for the second consecutive day. The most controversial of them, reviving construction of the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines. And Mr. Trump is expected to take executive action on immigration later this week. He tweeted late Tuesday night, "Big day planned on national security tomorrow. Among many other things, we will build the wall." I want to turn now to Matea Gold in Washington. She's a national political reporter with the Washington Post, and she's done some in-depth reporting that takes readers behind the scenes of the Trump administration. Her much talked about story, co-written with the Post's Philip Rucker and Ashley Parker, is titled "The First Days Inside Trump's White House: Fury, Tumult, and a Reboot." All right, Matea, thanks so much for being with us. A lot to get to. First of all, when Sean Spicer faced questions about Mr. Trump's claim of voter fraud, he suggested that it was President Trump's personal belief, but not the White House's overall stance. But if Mr. Trump says he believes it, isn't it then the policy of the administration?
Well, it is, and I think what we're seeing right now is Trump's aides really struggling to figure out how to translate something that has been repeatedly debunked by fact checkers, including ours, and explain why the president is still holding on to this belief. It's something that even Republican leaders on the Hill are distancing themselves from, and I think it really speaks to the difficulty of this administration in its early days with a president who clearly has some beliefs that he's unwilling to shed despite the facts before him.
But could it be, Matea, that there's some kind of strategy to this, perhaps?
Well, what we've heard from Trump advisors is that when President Trump gets an idea in his head and really feels strongly about it, it is very difficult to dissuade him of it. And I think we saw this Saturday with this issue of the inaugural crowds, in which aides were clearly urging him not to come out and have his press secretary raise this issue that he had larger crowds than any other president in history. And, you know, we don't know what the behind the scenes conversations were about this issue of the allegations of voter fraud, but, you know, all strategists around the White House have been proclaiming very loudly that it is really counterproductive for the White House to be pursuing this. And so I think it's hard to see it as a strategy that is a winning and intentional one.
All right, Matea, on another issue here, we're seeing reports that President Trump is preparing executive action to limit entry from countries with majority Muslim populations. He's also expected to sign directives about security on the southern border. What gaps will you be looking out for between him and fellow Republicans on this issue?
Well, there's a lot of questions that'll be raised by what actually comes out on Wednesday. And my colleague Robert Costa has been reporting that actually we're going to see a series of announcements on immigration that will continue after Wednesday. You know, one of the big questions is the dreamers who are here under DACA, what will happen with them? There'll be enormous pushback if there's an effort to really target them in the early days from Democrats and some Republicans as well. And really the language of the immigration executive actions is going to be closely scrutinized for how they're really going to put in place this policy to limit refugees from certain countries, and what screening mechanisms are they going to use, and are they actually going to be workable?
All right, we'll continue to watch that. But you had some really fascinating, detailed reporting behind the scenes of the Trump administration. Talk to us about the factions you see emerging in the White House.
Sure. So I think that there are several different dynamics playing out in the White House right now that are leading to these tumultuous early days of the administration. One is President Trump's own tendency to react, and some would say overreact, to perceptions that he's not as strong or as popular as he would like to as he believes. And the other is the fact that he put in place very intentionally sort of two power centers in the White House. There's Stephen Bannon, who is his chief strategist, who is really aligned with Kellyanne Conway, who has emerged as a very prominent advisor. And then we have sort of the more pragmatic political nuts and bolts operation run by Reince Priebus, the former RNC chair, and Jared Kushner, who is Trump's son-in-law, is also very aligned with Reince and looking for a way to implement his father-in-law's strategies. And so we already see a dynamic in which there's going to be different advisors at different times who have President Trump's ear, and that he's really going to rely on to execute whatever his priority is at that moment.
On that dynamic, I want to put up this quote from your story. It reads, quote, "During the campaign, Trump was suspicious of both Priebus and Spicer, who were seen as more loyal to the party than to its nominee. Some privately wonder whether Conway is now trying to undermine Spicer." So, Matea, based on that, how should we understand Sean Spicer's role in the White House?
Well, there's no question that he was not President Trump's first choice. President Trump had told associates he preferred a woman in that role. First of all, he has a very strong idea of the physical appearance of different advisors in the role they should play. He thought that he should have a female press secretary. He was dissuaded from his earlier choices, and so Reince Priebus really urged him to take Spicer, who came out of the RNC. So, you know, his relationship with Spicer will really be tested here on Saturday, when Spicer came out and delivered this very angry scolding of the press about its coverage of the inaugural crowds. You know, Trump, we heard, was actually critical of the way he was reading the statement. So I think it's a very difficult position for him to be in as press secretary, and that's a dynamic we'll be closely watching.
And Matea, we only have about a minute left, but you also write about Kellyanne Conway. It's been fascinating to see that she really has been, in many ways, the face of the administration on television, but she's not actually in the communications office. Explain that dynamic, and could that create challenges for the administration potentially moving forward?
Sure. There's actually several different sort of parallel comm shops within the White House. Kellyanne Conway has said she might limit her television appearances, but we haven't seen evidence of that yet. There's no question that I think she is someone who has the president's ear, though, and so it'll be fascinating to watch how much he leans on her and keeps her in front of the cameras, because I think he believes that's a role she's very strong in.
Really interesting read. Matea Gold, thanks so much for your time. Appreciate it. Meanwhile, Democrats are blasting President Trump's claim that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally in November's election. But during a Senate leadership news conference on Tuesday, the claim was called nonsensical. And Minority Leader Chuck Schumer said it's time the president start acting like it. But some Republicans voiced support for Mr. Trump's argument.
You cannot run a government. You cannot help people. You cannot keep America safe if you don't actually admit to the facts, plain and simple. And unless that starts happening, this country's going to have real trouble.
Regarding Mr. Trump's delusional statement that 3 to 5 million people voted illegally in the last election. That is a total nonsensical statement. The great political and democratic crisis we face now in this country is not voter fraud, it is voter suppression.
On the whole issue of election fraud, which our Democratic colleagues always argue is just fiction, there are people literally in jail in Kentucky for this kind of activity. It does occur. There are always arguments on both sides about how much, how frequent, and all the rest. But the notion that election fraud is a fiction is not true.
Congressional correspondent Nancy Cortez is on Capitol Hill. All right, so Nancy, we heard Democrats there using some forceful language there with respect to President Trump's claim. You also asked House Speaker Paul Ryan about it. What have you been hearing on the Hill?
Well, what Speaker Ryan said was much more forceful than what his Senate counterpart Mitch McConnell had to say in that clip you just played. He said point blank he sees no evidence to support Mr. Trump's claim, and he said that this is something that he has said in the past. I pushed him on that, and I said, but are you concerned that you're dealing with a president who sometimes is subscribing to his own set of facts? And Speaker Ryan simply said that he's going to stay focused on policy and not get involved in all this back and forth. It's a tricky issue for Republicans because they don't want to look like they are getting crosswise with the new president. They don't want to contradict him. They don't want to criticize him. But at the same time, they really wish, Elaine, that he would stay focused on the issues at hand, because they see this, A, as a distraction, B, as untrue, and C, they really don't like having to answer for some of the claims that he's making.
Meantime, Nancy, of course, 3 of President Trump's nominees face lawmakers in the Senate on Tuesday, including Mick Mulvaney, chosen to be the head of the Office of Management and Budget. At one point, a Democratic senator from Oregon, Senator Jeff Merkley, pressed Mulvaney, though, on the president's perception of inaugural crowds from Friday. Let's take a listen to that.
I have behind me 2 pictures that were taken at about the same time of day in 2009 and 2017. Which crowd is larger, the 2009 crowd or the 2017 crowd?
Senator, if you allow me to give the disclaimer that I'm not really sure how this ties to OMB, I'll be happy to answer your question, which was from that picture. It does appear that the crowd on the left-hand side is bigger than the crowd on the right-hand side.
Thank you. The president disagreed about this in his news report. He said, it's a lie. We caught them. We caught them in a beauty, referring to the press reporting. Says it looked like 1.5 million people.
All right, Senator Merkley went on to say that the president's team, quote, wants to embrace a fantasy over a reality. So, Nancy, what did you make of that exchange?
Well, the point that he and other Democrats are trying to make is not that President Obama had a bigger crowd than President Trump, but that Mr. Trump is sticking to a set of facts, alternative facts, as his press aide famously put it, that they say is very troubling, because when it comes to something like crowd size, it's kind of trivial. But what if it comes to policy? What if it comes to foreign policy? What if he gets dug in some of these policy debates, even with his own party, and he is subscribing to conspiracy theories or alternative realities, and members of Congress or his own staffers can't make much headway with him. And the question that Democrats are asking is, isn't there anyone on the president's own staff who can sort of talk some sense into him on some of these issues and convince him that some of these assertions are getting in the way of his agenda and creating a headache for the entire Republican Party here on Capitol Hill?
On another topic, Nancy, one of the other notable hearings was held for Health and Human Services nominee Congressman Tom Price, who's been under increasing scrutiny since President Trump signed the order to dismantle parts of Obamacare. What do we know about where Congressman Price's nomination stands?
Well, Republicans are still broadly supportive of his nomination. So he had to go through a second confirmation hearing, which is kind of unusual. But his agency, Health and Human Services, the agency he wants to lead, is so large that it actually comes under the jurisdiction of a couple different Senate committees. And that's why he had to testify once before the Health Committee and then this time before the Budget Committee. Again, Democrats had a lot of tough questions for him about this Obamacare replacement. What would it look like? What would it mean for people with pre-existing conditions? What would it mean for people who had gotten their insurance via the exchanges? And they felt that he really couldn't answer some of their basic questions. In fact, there was kind of a funny moment on a serious topic when Sherrod Brown, a very progressive senator from Ohio, asked Mr. Price about this supposed plan that the president says is all but complete. this plan to replace Obamacare, which came as a big surprise to Republicans on Capitol Hill who don't really think that such a plan exists. And Congressman Price responded jokingly, well, it is true that the president has said that this plan exists. So even he was able to make a little bit of light of that. And, it is a challenge for anyone who is representing this administration. They're going to get peppered with questions about what the replacement is going to look like. And the reality is that that is something that is still very much in the early stages, and it's being hashed out by the White House and by Republican leaders here on Capitol Hill.
Boy, every word parsed right now, Nancy. All right, finally, the Trump administration has put a media blackout on the EPA. No press releases, no blogging, no social media. Do we have any idea, Nancy, what the impetus for this was?
Well, there are probably a couple of impetuses, Elaine. One is that this administration is certainly going to take a very different approach to the EPA than the Obama administration did. They want to cut regulations. They're far more skeptical about the impact of man on climate change. And so the EPA is going to look very different. And they are going to want their Facebook posts, their blog posts, their Twitter feed to reflect that. And so they've imposed this moratorium, particularly because we've seen that some other agencies, most notably the Park Service, had tweeted out some things that the incoming administration did not agree with. And so what we don't know right now is whether this ban is permanent, whether it's just for a couple of weeks until the new administration can kind of get its feet on the ground, take a look at the EPA, figure out how it wants to change things. And I think that will be the big question is, are these people being permanently silenced who work for the Environmental and Protection Agency, or are they just being told to hold off for now while we get our feet on the ground, while we figure out what our message is, and then we'll start back up again?
All right, we know you'll continue to watch it. Nancy Court is on Capitol Hill for us. Nancy, thank you.
You're welcome.
Senate Democrats on Tuesday unveiled a $1 trillion plan to revamp the nation's infrastructure. The proposal would rely on direct federal spending and would include a range of projects, from bridges and tunnels to the nation's broadband network and VA hospitals. Democrats say their plan would also create 15 million jobs over 10 years. But Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell says it would add too much to the national debt. Instead, Republicans are calling for a plan that would rely on tax credits for developers. Democrats argue this type of funding would fail to generate enough construction and would result in the creation of too many toll roads to finance costs. McConnell's support is essential for any infrastructure measure succeeding in Congress. Nikki Haley is the latest Trump nominee to be confirmed by the Senate. The South Carolina governor was overwhelmingly confirmed to her new position as the United States ambassador to the United Nations late Tuesday. The 45-year-old, who has limited experience in foreign policy, was in her second term as governor. Haley is the fourth cabinet-level nominee to be confirmed, following President Trump's picks for secretaries of defense and Homeland Security, along with the director of the CIA. Coming up, President Trump takes executive action on the Dakota Access and Keystone XL pipelines. Now activists who oppose the projects are responding. We'll talk with one of them just ahead. But first, life after Hillary Clinton. The head of the former Democratic nominee's super PAC discusses his hopes and plans for recharging the party. Next, you're watching Red and Blue. James Comey told his agents Tuesday that he will stay on as FBI director under the Trump administration. Comey has served as the head of the bureau since September 2013. President Trump has been critical of Comey in the past, specifically for not pursuing charges against his former opponent, Hillary Clinton. But the president was very friendly with Comey at a law enforcement gathering over the weekend. It's worth noting that Comey is in the middle of a 10-year term, a standard since 1976, and only one FBI director has been fired before the completion of his term. The Democratic National Committee will meet in just a few weeks to pick its next leader. Minnesota Congressman Keith Ellison and former Obama Labor Secretary Tom Perez are considered favorites for the post, and they're laying out their vision for the Democratic Party. Hundreds of thousands marched on Washington over the weekend to voice their opposition to the Trump administration and the Republican-led Congress. And Democrats are now asking how they can translate those marches into votes come 2018. Guy Cecil is in Washington. He's chairman of the Priorities USA Super PAC, which supported Hillary Clinton in the 2016 presidential campaign. I first want to get your thoughts on Mr. Trump's renewed claim that millions of people voted illegally. We should note that Mr. Trump's claims haven't been backed up with evidence.
Well, I think one of the challenges for journalists is finding new synonyms for the word lie. We've called them deceptions. We've called them misstatements. Finally, the New York Times today listed it as exactly what it is, and that is a lie. There is no evidence. There never has been of widespread voter fraud, despite what the majority leader said. And in fact, what we do know that there's evidence of is efforts around the country from state legislators and governors who are engaging in all sorts of voter suppression. In fact, an organization that I run, Every Citizen Counts, was engaged in litigation in North Carolina. And through that discovery process, we actually uncovered state legislators and elected officials specifically targeting African-American precincts and counties, reducing the number of early vote locations, all with the specific intention of driving down turnout. And so the real issue here is not voter fraud. It never has been. It's in fact voter suppression by Republican elected officials and activists around the country. But this is just another example of Donald Trump looking into the faces of the American people and just flat out lying to them.
So, given what you just said, as a matter of strategy, how would you advise Democrats to respond to Mr. Trump's claims?
Well, first of all, we need to be on the front lines every day and everywhere fighting against voter intimidation. We need to make sure that we are engaged in litigation, in social action, in lobbying in state legislatures. We need to hold Democratic governors and state legislatures accountable for expanding the right to vote in their state. I was very happy to see the governor of New York do that. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to Donald Trump, we are going to have to pick and choose which fights we wage. Every day, he deceives the American people. And as we move forward, he's going to begin betraying the American people. You know, what was missed in most of the coverage of Donald Trump's first couple of days in office was actually an executive order that made it significantly more expensive for the poor and middle class Americans to access mortgages. We're going to see these types of actions that betray the people he claimed that he was going to represent through the course of the election. And part of our responsibility at Priorities is going to make sure that we're holding him accountable every single time he does it.
Well, on another issue here, we saw these demonstrations around the world over the weekend. How does the Democratic Party capitalize on that enthusiasm?
You know, obviously, for those of us who are progressive, that care about these issues, the election was incredibly dispiriting. But, you know, I've spent a lot of time over the last 5 weeks traveling around the country. I've met with local organizers and activists. I've attended church services. I've met with union presidents and organization leaders. And, you know, through all of this, I am encouraged by a renewed sense of commitment, not just on the part of elected officials or Democratic Party officials or DNC chair candidates, but on young people, on local organizers who are out there doing the important work. And so there's no question. This is just day 4 of the administration. We have a lot of work to do to organize ourselves to engage in local and state elections, something Democrats have dropped the ball on over the last 8 years. But I'm incredibly encouraged by what I saw in D.C. and around the country, a renewed sense of commitment, of local organizing, and of calling this president to account. And it's something that's going to be critical, not just on the first March day, but in every single day since, calling members of Congress, organizing local communities, inviting neighbors over to discuss what's happening in their city councils and their state legislatures. So I think we're just at the very beginning of this process, but we have, I think, a lot of reasons to be optimistic that we're seeing the rebirth of the progressive movement in this country.
Well, you put out a tweet asking which candidates for DNC chair participated in the marches. The Washington Post says only South Bend, Indiana Mayor Pete Buttigieg did. Why did you raise that question?
Well, look, I think it's important that our elected officials and our party leaders are accountable. And all of them have talked about the importance of local organizing. I think, you know, the two folks you mentioned, Keith Ellison and Tom Perez, have introduced a lot of good ideas about how we can bring power back to the local levels of our party, how we can organize a 50-state strategy. But there's no question that it's important that action meets words. And in this particular case, I was encouraged to see that Pete had marched in his local parade and local march, rather. And that's not the only action that can be taken. But it's important that we actually say and do things that are going to build our party from the ground up. And I think that was a good example of someone doing it.
Well, as you know, the RNC put out a report, a postmortem after Mitt Romney's loss to President Obama in 2012. If you had to write one for the DNC in 2016, what would the first 3 bullet points be?
Well, I do think it's interesting to note that the autopsy that the Republicans did called for a more open-minded and fair Republican Party that embraced immigration and Hispanic voters. And in fact, over the course of the last 4 years, we've gotten the exact opposite, an exclusionary Republican Party that has decided its path to power is to pit one group of Americans against the other. But the 3 bullet points for Democrats, I think, are clear. 1, we have to engage and invest in a 50-state strategy. 2, we need to make sure that we're paying as much attention in the next 2 years to state legislative races and governor's races as we are federal races. And number 3, we need to stay focused on answering one simple question. How do the American people hear and see when Donald Trump is betraying them? Because the fact of the matter is, many of them are not reading their local newspaper. They're not watching cable news. They're getting information online. They're getting information from their friends and neighbors. And this is something that Priorities is going to be really invested in, making sure that we are doing all we can to reach out to folks that voted for President Obama and then voted for President Trump, African-American voters who chose not to vote in this election, young people who in many cases sat out. We've got a lot of work to do to make sure we're communicating up and down the ticket in all 50 states, and that would be the primary focus if I were writing the autopsy.
Guy Cecil in Washington. Guy, thanks very much for your perspective.
Thanks for having me.
President Trump stuck to more of his campaign promises Tuesday, signing presidential memoranda that would advance the Keystone XL and Dakota Access pipelines. Both projects were blocked by the Obama administration, in part because of environmental concerns. As he signed the memos, the president suggested the Keystone XL pipeline could create thousands of jobs.
Much pipeline is bought from other countries. From now on, we're going to start making pipeline in the United States. We build it in the United States. We build the pipelines. We want to build the pipe. Got to put a lot of workers, a lot of steel workers back to work.
Josh Fox is the filmmaker behind the documentary Gasland, and he joins me now. Josh, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So what do these executive actions actually do?
Well, it's unclear actually right now, because there is Earth Justice and many other environmental organizations are calling them illegal or less than legal, because what they do is they overthrow the due process and the rule of law that's been in place on these pipelines. Keystone XL certainly incredibly unpopular. Millions of Americans came out and opposed it. And the Dakota Access pipeline, the Obama administration ordered, and the Army Corps of Engineers, by the way, ordered an environmental impact study because this pipeline has the possibility of affecting 18 million Americans' water supply. And that's no small thing. These pipelines leak all the time. We've had 3,300 major pipeline spills in the United States between 2010 and 2015. So water concerns at Standing Rock Reservation are primary. And also, of course, this is an issue of indigenous sovereignty as well.
So you've traveled to these places. Tell us what it is that you have seen. What are the concerns that people living around these areas have?
Well, when a pipeline bursts, there's really no way to clean it up. You're talking about an underground spill of oil and gas. If that that gets into underground sources of drinking water, those sources of drinking water are contaminated forever. If it gets into surface water, like a river or a stream, it's extremely difficult to clean up. We've seen the Yellowstone River, the Kalamazoo River. We've seen beaches in Santa Barbara completely soiled by black oil. We've seen whole towns smothered in black oil, like Mayflower, Arkansas, which had to be completely abandoned. So these are not trivial safety concerns, and that is at the primary objective of the water protectors at Standing Rock, who have been putting their bodies on the line and standing in between the bulldozers and the pipeline and their water source, which is the only source of water for the reservation, but also the Missouri River, the source of water for 18 million people.
What would you say to proponents of these pipelines who argue that having rail transfer this oil from one place to another is not safe, is not as safe as these pipelines would be, and so therefore what you're actually doing is making it safer for people living in and around these areas where this oil is going to be
Well,
transported?
that's the kind of crazy logic of the oil industry. It's like asking somebody if you'd rather be stabbed or would you rather be shot. I mean, we know that the bomb trains derail and they explode.
What are
and
the
they've
bomb
killed.
trains? What are you
Bomb trains are, we call them bomb trains because they explode like bombs. In fact, they've killed people in the middle of the night in their towns when they've ignited and exploded.
Because explain how combustible we're talking about this material.
Well, this is oil, right? So you know that it can ignite, and if a train derails into a river, into a stream, into a town, they often explode, and we've seen terrifying instances of that. In fact, in Lac-Mégantic, Quebec, 74 people were killed in the middle of the night in the center of their town when one of these bomb trains derailed.
So pipelines would be safer than these trains?
Well, no, because as I said, we've had 3,300 major pipeline spills. Water is more important than oil and gas at this point in America. You know, 80% of Americans want renewable energy. These pipelines are what is getting in the way of that market advancing, solar, wind, all the things that we know we need to do because of climate change and because of public health and safety. So 80% of people in America want renewable energy, and 100% of people in America want clean water. Donald Trump is standing up in a I would say, a very tyrannical way and saying, this is my purview. I'm going to do this in a very Donald Trump kind of way. I'm just going to bulldoze the entire legal process. I'm going to run over all the people who are objecting to this with very, very clear and valid objections and sign these executive orders. And I think this is going to be a court case. I think this is going to be a battle that goes on for quite a while. And at Standing Rock, they're calling for new water protectors to come to camp and say, please join us here now in North Dakota. 18,000 people have been at that camp at certain points in time. That is what has stopped this pipeline, because people are willing to put their bodies in front of this dirty oil for justice and for their water.
The argument from the Trump administration, though, is that having these pipelines in place will actually create jobs. You're going to have, as he said, the actual pipe made in America. You're going to have the work to install these things done by Americans and bring to people something that they've been calling for, which is more and more jobs. What would you say
as
to
with
that?
everything that Donald Trump says, it's vastly exaggerated. Those job claims don't stand up when you really actually look at how many jobs there are versus jobs in a very growing sector of renewable energy, solar and wind. We only need so much energy. We do not need this oil. This oil is only going to enrich oil barons and people who would advance the cause of the fossil fuel industry, which is, you know, causing us a lot of damage in terms of climate change and all these effects on water supplies. We need American jobs to be renewable energy jobs, wind, solar. There are vastly more jobs in those growing sectors than they are in the slowly declining and disappearing fossil fuel industry. And that is, you know, I think one of the things that is going to unite Americans against this administration and say, we see through this ruse, we see through the billionaires that you want to promote, because we know that the better jobs are in renewable energy, the safer jobs, and by the way, many, many more jobs.
I want to look back for a moment. Some have criticized President Obama, former President Obama, for the way he handled the Keystone Pipeline. Are you satisfied with the way in which that was handled?
Well, I think that was certainly better than signing an executive order and just saying, just bulldoze all these people's concerns. Keystone XL was stopped by a coalition of people from all across the nation. There were people in Nebraska, traditional Republicans, white farmers, who said, no, you can't put your pipeline through our backyard. So this was an issue of eminent domain for private gain, that a multinational foreign company, right, a Canadian company, was going to be able to put their pipeline through Americans' backyards, jeopardize the Oglala Aquifer. The same thing is true of the Dakota Access Pipeline. This oil, by the way, most of it will be going for export. It's supposed to go down to the Gulf of Mexico, where it's going to be refined there and sent overseas. This isn't even for American use. So what you have right here are people who are exploiting the United States of America as if we were a third world nation and ramming a pipeline through an indigenous sovereign tribe at Standing Rock and imperiling 18 million people's water supply, as well as exacerbating climate change and holding us back from the future that we all want in America, which is renewable energy. So this is a travesty of justice. It's a travesty of the environment. And in many people's view, it's illegal. So I think this will be challenged in court, but definitely challenged on the front lines with people's bodies. There are protests happening in D.C., New York, L.A., San Francisco, and people are coming out already to oppose this.
Sounds like something we'll be hearing about in the days and weeks ahead. Josh Fox, thanks so much for your perspective. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Up next, we'll take a look at the headlines that will give you a head start for Wednesday, including details on a campaign promise that President Trump may not be keeping. Plus, what if you connected the person that sold a weapon used in a deadly shooting with a member of the victim's family? Could they change each other's minds about guns? One journalist tried to find out. I'll speak with her when Red and Blue returns after this. Here's a look at some of the headlines you'll be talking about on Wednesday. Bloomberg reports that President Trump isn't keeping all of his campaign promises. The administration is continuing to grant work permits to undocumented immigrants who arrived in the U.S. as children. It's part of a program created by former President Obama that's allowed more than 700,000 people to get renewable 2-year work permits. And the New York Daily News says the Badlands National Park Twitter account went rogue on Tuesday. The account sent out a series of tweets about climate change, but they've since been deleted. This comes just days after the official National Park Service account was forced to shut down for retweeting photos comparing President Trump's inauguration crowd to President Obama's. An NPS official reportedly said in a statement, the tweets came from a former employee who was not currently authorized to use the park's account. And the Washington Post reports President Trump invited India's prime minister to the United States. Trump reportedly called Prime Minister Modi on Tuesday and said the U.S. considers India a true friend and partner in addressing challenges around the world. President Trump tweeted Tuesday night about recent violence in Chicago, writing, "If Chicago doesn't fix the horrible carnage going on, 228 shootings in 2017 with 42 killings, I will send in the feds." It's unclear what exactly Mr. Trump meant when he said he'd send in the feds. It's also unclear what provoked the tweet, though it comes a day after Chicago Mayor Rahm Emanuel publicly blasted President Trump for fixating on the crowd size for his inauguration. Well, it seems like everything in our current political environment is polarized, but the gunfight might be the most divisive. In a recent cover story for New York Magazine, contributing editor Lisa Miller posed the question, can a gun victim and a gun advocate change each other's mind? And Lisa Miller joins me now. Lisa, such a fascinating concept here. For this piece, you partnered with a nonprofit Narrative 4 for what you called an experiment. Explain what it was that you were trying to do here.
Okay, so we invited 16 people on all sides of the guns issue to New York to have a conversation about guns. Each person we invited had a personal story about guns. One person had a daughter who was killed in a mass shooting, and there was a mom who lost her son in Sandy Hook. We had the man who runs the website that sold the gun that killed Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman's gun. We had hunters, we had police officers, we had people on all sides of the issue, and we put them in pairs, and we asked them to tell each other their personal stories about guns, and then to stand up the next day as the person that they were talking to and tell their story in the first person. So what that meant was a woman who watched her child get shot in a mall at a mass shooting had to stand up and say, my name is Todd Underwood, and I run the website that sold the gun that killed Trayvon Martin.
I mean, it's ambitious to say the least, but what did you expect to come out of that?
We didn't know what to expect. I mean, Narrative 4, they do this. This is what they do. They've been doing it for more than a dozen years, and they do it in schools and on issues around the country. So they have a tried and true tested method, but they had never done anything around an issue so divisive and so controversial. And we didn't know what to expect. We put the people in pairs and we asked them to tell their stories, and it was incredible to see how open some people were to this experience and how fully they embodied the other person's story, so that empathy or understanding really did happen in this absolutely breathtaking and almost devastating way.
Yeah, because I say ambitious because it really required the participants to step fully into the shoes of another.
Right. I mean, I say in the story, I didn't understand why you needed to use the pronoun I when you told the other person's story. I am Todd Underwood. I sold the gun. But when you see it happening, you understand that it really does force you to embody the other person's world in a way that you're not used to doing in your everyday life.
So we were talking off camera about this, Lisa. The notion is there was a lot of work that went into just putting these people together and getting them to open up in this way.
Yes.
It seems like that might be a difficult thing to translate in a more widespread way, but you say what to that?
Well, I say that there's a ripple effect. In the central pair in the story, which was the website guy and the mom of the mass shooting victim, who herself was shot 3 times. He friended her on Facebook after the whole thing was over. And now he's her friend on Facebook among all of her friends who are mostly gun control advocates and people who wouldn't understand him or his point of view at all. And for his part, he went home to Kansas City and he changed the rules on his website so that people who are buying and selling and chatting on the website that trades and sells guns have to identify themselves in a verifiable way before they can actually engage on his website. So it's not a background check, it's not what the gun control advocates want fully, but it's a tiny little step. And so both of these people took tiny little steps in the direction of each other, and all of the people around them have seen that happen.
And so what would be sort of the lesson, the takeaway from this experiment that you conducted? Is there one takeaway?
I mean, we were talking off camera, talk about empathy. We talk about how important it is. We talk about having compassion for each other and seeing each other as human beings in this terribly, terribly divisive time. And we know just how hard that is. We're all so siloed. We're all in our bubbles. But the takeaway is that it is possible. I saw it happen with my own eyes, and I'm telling you, nobody in that room will ever forget what they saw when these people transformed themselves into each other. And we have the human capacity for understanding each other, not as, people who are waving flags for particular issues, but as parents, as Americans, as people who want the best future for ourselves and for our families. And when we can find common ground as humans, we can maybe, make some progress in a positive direction. And that's the hope anyway.
We live in such a polarizing time. It was such a bitter election. What would you like to see from this new administration?
Well, I think more empathy, and not just, the Colin McCann, who is one of the co-founders of Narrative 4 and who's a novelist, talks about empathy as a muscular thing. It's not this sort of namby-pamby, kumbaya, we're all so nice to each other all the time thing. Like, we're not. In the story, we talk about Samaria Rice, whose son Tamir Rice was shot by police, and we asked her to have empathy for a police officer, and she said, I'm not doing that. I'm not participating in
really
that.
difficult.
I'm not going to tell my story to a police officer. And I thought, that's really understandable. But what I do think is that if we all have the strength to look at each other in the faces and say, we're human, and we may not be able to go all the way there, but we can go some of the way there. I think that's a big step.
Really fascinating piece and a powerful experiment, too. Lisa Miller from New York Magazine, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks, it was great to be here.